Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Azdren Soma. Today I will be talking about open-ended questions. And in this episode I will cover the purpose of open-ended questions, the types of open-ended questions, the pros and cons. I will share several examples, and finally I will end with some tips for best practices when implementing open-ended questions in surveys. You might think it's intuitive when to use open-ended questions, but there's more nuance than it first appears. The way I think of open-ended questions is that they are useful when researchers cannot fully anticipate the range of possible answers, or when they want respondents to answer in their own words rather than selecting from predefined categories. Every day after school, I survey my son. I ask him, "How was your day today?" on a scale from very bad to good to very good. He answers, and then I ask him a follow-up. Why was it bad, or why was it good? I want to know why it was bad or good. The problem, though, as many of you might have guessed, is that sometimes getting a 6-year-old to talk about their day is almost impossible. Or they might satisfy us in a way that they just say what they think I want to hear instead of telling the truth. But this little family ritual actually highlights exactly why researchers turn to open-ended questions. I'm going to build on this idea by looking at what the survey research literature says about when and why open-ended questions are especially powerful. According to Dillman, Smith, and Christian's 2014 book, Internet Phone, Mail, and Mixed Method Surveys, open-ended questions are useful when researchers want to do 3 things. 1. Discover unanticipated responses that may not be captured by fixed response categories. Or 2. Understand reasoning or explanations behind attitudes or behaviors. 3. Collect detailed or nuanced information from respondents. In other words, open-ended questions are great when we are doing exploratory research, or when we do not know all the possible answers to a question, like when a topic is too complex or nuanced for a scale, or when we want to really give respondents a chance to express their deeper thoughts on a subject. Now that we understand the core purposes, let's explore the different forms these questions can take in a survey. Open-ended questions come in different shapes and sizes. They can be free text format, where respondents write an essay if they want, or they can be a fill-in-the-blank. Some questions, like entering a birth year, use open numeric fields, which are more structured and typically require less effort than narrative responses. Or they might be semi-structured, like with a closed-ended list, with an other please specify option as one of the choices. The length of an open-ended question can vary from very short space, only a few characters width, to an entire page or more. Keep in mind that from a design perspective, the length of space of an open-ended question also communicates to the respondent what type of answer you were looking for. So, if your space is just 10 characters wide, don't expect an essay. On the other hand, if you are asking respondents to enter the year they were born, a respondent shouldn't be presented with a text box that spans the width of the survey. Speaking of design signals and respondent effort, this brings us to the heart of this discussion: weighing the pros and cons. The pros, as we've already seen before, is that with open-ended questions, you can get richer data. You can get a better understanding of what people are thinking. You can give people an opportunity to share their thoughts, and you can discover new ideas. For example, an open-ended question can help us improve closed-ended questions that we are developing for later. If most open-ended responses fall into 4 or 5 categories, then it may be useful to convert that into a closed-ended question in future surveys. But those richer insights come at a cost. Let's turn to the main reason researchers sometimes avoid, or at least limit, open-ended questions. A major drawback with open-ended questions is that they require a high response burden. It simply takes more time and cognitive effort for respondents to complete the survey with open-ended questions, which also results in a more expensive survey if you are paying respondents an hourly rate, or if you need a certain number of completes. The use of open-ended questions can mean a higher drop-off rate. which might mean that you will need to collect more data for the missing respondents. But it might also mean that the people dropping off from the survey are substantially different from those who complete the survey, which will result in greater non-response error. An obvious problem with open-ended questions is that the data is a lot more difficult to analyze. Often, responses need to be categorized, or a researcher might need to interpret key highlights from the responses. And in either of these cases, there is a risk of subjectivity introduced. Furthermore, even if we somehow magically eliminate all subjective differences in how the data is analyzed, the fact remains that open-ended questions simply take more time to analyze than closed-ended questions. And I haven't even begun to discuss how to code the open-ended responses, how to establish a coding scheme, or how to ensure that when more than one person is coding the same data, that it is reliable. But if you're curious about coding open-ended responses, while the most common tool I've seen used to code open-ended responses is simply Microsoft Excel, I've also seen researchers use software like NVivo. So if you're curious, I would look into that. One more reason I could think of as to why open-ended questions might sometimes pose extra challenges is that there are mixed mode effects. The same open-ended question might produce different responses based on the mode it is asked. So, if you're conducting a mixed mode survey, you might get different data depending if the respondent is taking the survey on the web, if they are self-administering the survey on paper, or if the survey is being conducted over the phone. I know that for myself, I would provide a longer and more detailed answer on the web than on paper, since my handwriting is pretty terrible. But on the other hand, you should keep in mind that large text boxes on mobile device can also frustrate respondents and may disproportionately increase the burden of respondents on mobile. Now that we know some of the pros and cons of open-ended questions, let's look at examples of when they might be used. One common place I've used open-ended questions is when conducting program evaluation surveys. If the goal of the survey is to capture the conference goer's experience, it is useful to the organizers of the conference to get an overall sense of what everyone's experience was like. So, they might first ask a closed-ended question like how respondents might rate the usefulness of the conference on a scale from very poor to excellent. Then, the follow-up question asks, please share why you gave our conference this rating, followed by a paragraph-long space for respondents to share their thoughts. This way, as a program evaluator, it is possible to get an overall quantitative sense of how people felt about the usefulness of the conference, but then the qualitative data from the open-ended questions also exists to support the quantitative findings. The two questions are complementary, and they help paint a clearer picture for whoever might be reading the findings. Another way to understand the framing of this second question is that it is a follow-up neutral probing to encourage fuller responses without bias. In the same survey, I might ask a follow-up open-ended question, which might ask some things like, what did you find most useful about the conference? Or, how could the conference be improved? Keep in mind, though, when asking a question about how the conference can be improved, analyzing the data might be challenging. It might be true that most respondents might be categorized into the same types of responses. Some people might say that the food can be better, or the start time could be changed, or something about the venue. But every once in a while, a respondent might say something that is unique to them, which might be exceptionally insightful and useful to the evaluation of the conference. Even though that might be just one response out of hundreds, the beauty of open-ended responses is that it only takes one person to sometimes provide an insight or a perspective which can drastically help things moving forward. Most commonly, I like to add an open-ended question at the end of the survey that offers a chance for respondents to share their comments, questions, or concerns. This way, it is kind of an all-encompassing catch-all if the respondent might have felt like they had something to say that might not have been properly captured in the questions above. This open-ended question is optional, and most people skip it, but I've also found a lot of useful feedback shared within this question. Another simple example of when using an open-ended question might be useful is when collecting data on the age of a respondent. I find that asking their birth year is faster than having respondents select their age from a drop-down menu. So, asking a respondent to type in their birth year may actually decrease their burden of time and effort of having to look for and find their year on a drop down list. Similarly, if it is necessary to collect data on where someone lives, or was born, or their current city or zip code, or their weight, it might make more sense that you ask in an open ended format. But this is contingent on needing to collect data as high resolution as birth year. If you need just broader age categories, stick to asking age categories in a closed ended question. I also want to briefly note that while collecting a respondent's age or zip code may be less of a burden to respondents, you will get messier data. You will get people entering their age in years instead of entering their birth year. Or they may only enter 4 digits for their zip code instead of 5. So again, you need to weigh the pros and cons of the question format you are choosing for your survey. There are 2 more examples of open-ended questions being used that I have to share that really get to the core of why you as a researcher really need to consider the pros and cons of using open-ended question. The first example is from a few years ago. While I was a graduate student, the leadership of the graduate student organization in our department decided to conduct an anonymous survey among graduate students to collect thoughts on issues within the department, then share those findings in an end of the semester town hall meeting, which is attended by all graduate students and department leadership, including the chair and director of graduate studies. When I opened the survey, I saw that it had a couple open-ended questions. I thought about the open-ended questions long and hard before completing the survey. When I attended the town hall meeting, the graduate student leadership began presenting the survey results, sharing the sentiment of graduate students within the department. To my surprise, none of the data collected from the open-ended questions was presented. When I casually asked the leadership after the meeting why they didn't share any of those responses, they said that they simply didn't have time to analyze the data, so they only reported the closed-ended questions. I was disappointed, to say the least. Rather, I was frustrated. Not only did I feel like my time and effort was wasted, but it was worse that the department was not understanding the essence of the problems in the department, at least according to my experience. My representative was not representing. I felt cheated out of my voice. Sure, I could have said something during the meeting, but the point of having an anonymous survey is that people can express themselves more honestly and without concerns of retaliation or social stigma. If the surveyor knew that they didn't have the time to analyze the data, they could have simply not burdened us other graduate students with the emotional labor that happens when we're pouring our hearts and souls into those open-ended responses. Which really goes to show that there is an ethical obligation to properly analyzing and representing data collected from open-ended responses. There is an implicit contract with respondents. If you ask, you are obligated to listen. This idea of truly listening ties directly into my most recent project. I've been recently working on a project collecting data over a phone survey, asking about respondents' experiences with the government service. For context, this is a service provided to a vulnerable population. The survey is about 6 or 7 closed-ended questions, followed by one open-ended question at the end of the survey, which asks if they have anything else they want to say about the program. While most people don't have anything to say, and they simply choose to end the survey, there are some people that have a lot to say, which is great because that is what conducting the survey is all about. The protocol within this survey is that the interviewer writes down everything the respondent says over the phone as accurately as possible. When the respondent is done with their comment, the surveyor reads back everything that they wrote down to the respondent, which accomplishes several things. But mainly, it tells the respondent that the interviewer was listening carefully, but it also gives them a chance to ensure that their comment is accurate and reflective of what they wanted it to say. While this process of transcribing an open-ended question via a phone survey might seem difficult and tedious for the surveyor, the inclusion of the open-ended question is priceless for several reasons. The agency really gets a chance to understand their customers. The data is richer and more reflective of the target population, but also the customer feels like they are really listened to and that their thoughts are important and respected. Finally, some advice about using open-ended questions. If you want to include open-ended questions, first, make sure your respondents are properly motivated. It is important that your respondent has an understanding of why it is important for them to answer the open-ended question. You can use the principles of social exchange theory to motivate someone to provide better open-ended answers. Sometimes this depends on the placement of an open-ended question, and sometimes it means adding an additional line explaining what is going on. There is no one-size-fits-all advice here, but only that the more motivated your respondents are to answer your question, the better the data. But when you do decide to use open-ended questions, just remember to use them as sparingly as possible. Only include open-ended questions if you are going to use the data, and if you actually plan to analyze the data. When you do include open-ended questions, do your best to move them as close to the end of the questionnaire as possible. Although, on the other hand, if responses to the open-ended questions are essential, or if the question is highly engaging, then of course, earlier placement would be justified. But whatever you do, don't force people to respond to open questions. And just as with closed-ended questions, a good open-ended question avoids any leading language that might signal what kind of an answer you want. But beyond being neutral, you can also guide responses by being explicit about what you are after. Phrase the open-ended question to clearly signal the expected answer. For example, what is one thing that we could improve? Instead of a vague question like, any comments? And especially with open-ended questions, it is important to pre-test your questionnaire. What you think is a clear question may elicit one-word answers or confusion from real respondents. Broadly speaking, there are also certain cases when you should not use open-ended questions. This may include when respondents can't or won't put their thoughts into words, or when the cognitive burden is too high relative to the respondent's motivation, or when the survey is already too long. And open-ended questions should not be used, especially when you don't have the resources to code and analyze the responses properly. And finally, a word of caution about using generative AI to code open-ended questions. Let's be real, using generative AI to broadly summarize open-ended questions is effective. If you just want to get a broad sentiment of whether respondents generally feel one way or the other, then using AI will probably do the job. But if your goal is to just get a generalized sentiment in the first place, then we shouldn't even be using open-ended questions at all. In my experience, even if there was no hallucinations at all, generative AI tools are not good at understanding nuance, reading between the lines, understanding unusual responses, or understanding that one unique voice that stands out in a symphony of voices. Sometimes a respondent may say a lot, and generative AI may not know how to focus on that one key detail that might be said that might completely change the meaning of the whole comment. And furthermore, using generative AI to analyze open-ended question is not ethical when used as a replacement for careful human analysis. If someone is being vulnerable, is being honest, is opening up in a way that they are genuinely expressing themselves in your survey, it is not ethical to collect open-ended data if we're not even making the effort to capture the full breadth and depth of those respondents, including all the nuances and details they might be expressing. If you made it this far, I just want to say that I appreciate you listening. And if you'd like to write me, you can do so at totalsurveydesign@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a great day.